Hey guys, welcome to the Hypertrophy Hub podcast. So this week, I'm extremely excited to be chatting to Mike Tuchscherer. So this podcast, I've been wanting to do a podcast with Mike Tuchscherer for a while, but I don't know why. I sort of neglected to reach out, primarily because I was a little frightened because he's a smart guy. And like, I wanted to make sure that I did this stuff correctly because he talks about some things that when I first sort of saw them, I didn't really understand them. And then I had to sort of think about it a little more and now get down to, I guess, a little bit better of an understanding. And I wanted to get Mike on to discuss, I guess, his approach for a lot of things. There's a lot of things I want to chat about, but we'll see how many we end up sort of covering. So I think it'd be sort of good to start off sort of, Mike, would you better give an introduction of sort of what is your background in all of this stuff? I know you're a fantastic powerlifting coach with 12 world record setting powerlifters, which is just insane. Would you better give an intro sort of like, how did you, I guess, get into this, or how did you sort of come to this idea of coaching and the way you currently coach now? And I guess then we can transition into the emerging strategies stuff and then go from there.
Yeah, I guess coaching kind of found me. I was lifting weights. I'll kind of go through the short version, I guess, but I was lifting weights in high school. I was good at it. When I got into college, there was a powerlifting club, and I got involved with that. Now, this would have been early 2000s. Powerlifting was not super popular then. So while there was a club, there were 3 members. And in the second year of the club, both of the other members quit. So it was just me.
That is right.
So I was like, well, that's no fun. So I went on this recruiting spree and I got a bunch of other people who, lifted weights, but now we're going to compete, and I'm the old man on the team, and so I'm kind of thrust in this coaching role. So I coached my my university team for 3 years, and then learned a lot through the process. I was a really good lifter as well during this time frame. I won a junior world championship, and had set some records and things like that. And I thought, well, I'm coaching, I'm competing, I'm learning, and I was writing down kind of whatever I had learned along the way. And my original plan was to like maybe publish it as an article series in Powerlifting USA or something like that. But it kind of grew and grew. And at some point I thought, well, maybe I'll self-publish it as a book. And that's the Reactive Training Manual that, is still available today. Although a lot of stuff has changed since then, but I mean, the core principles are core principles, right? But shortly after that, someone sent me an email and was like, hey, will you coach me online? And I thought, that's a thing? You can do that? This would have been 2008 or so.
Wow.
So I started doing it. Started off as a side project, grew and grew, and my experience grew, and it helped that I was a good competitor for sure. But my experience with it grew and continued on, and started doing it full time. I've been doing it full time since 2012.
Wow. Yeah. And I think it's been cool for me to because I've been listening to your podcast a lot recently, as I've said, and it's I think it's been cool because you sort of, at least from what I've seen, has taken a lot of the powerlifting conversation and put some unique spins in it. You don't seem to just be contributing the same stuff. For instance, one of the things I'd like to talk about, one of the things that I think it's really thrown a spanner in the works of my thoughts around programming recently. Really, it has. And I think primarily for hypertrophy, that's my main thing. I only care about basically hypertrophy. And it's it's had quite an impact on that because it's made me rethink it, and it's sort of been at a crossroad where a lot of other things have been making me rethink things. Would you be able to sort of sum up, and I guess is the name reactive related to this? Would you be able to explain sort of, I guess, the why the reactive approach? Would you be able to, I guess, explain what is a reactive approach, and then I guess what led you to that approach?
So reactive training systems has been a thing for well, let's see, I guess since 2008, so 12 years now. And in 12 years, this might be the first time anyone's ever asked that question. Which is funny because, like, when I remember when I was first, when you first start a business, you're like, well, what am I going to call it? And I was thinking of reactive training systems, and I was anticipating that question, like, why reactive, not proactive? Or, that's kind of how it looked in my head, and then 12 years later, somebody asked the question. So it's kind of neat for me. But the reactive part of it came from RPE, really. So RPE, for anyone that isn't aware, RPE started in endurance sports. It was a 6 to 20 scale of how hard it felt, or how your rating of perceived exertion. It was originally supposed to correlate to heart rate. Didn't really work out that way, but the idea was there. And anyway, I try to speed that part of it along. I came in contact with the concept of RPE probably like 2005 or so, and I was coaching my university team, and I'm thinking like, well, everybody's talking about this concept of like, oh, leave a rep in the tank, which was like news to most lifters at the time. Like, well, wait, you don't have to take every set to like total volitional failure, right? Like, oh no, you leave a rep in the tank, like you'll be so much more recovered, right? And and I thought like, well, you have RPE, and you could kind of marry it up with this concept of leave a rep in the tank, and you don't have to leave just one. You could leave 2 or 3, or and like the rest of the RPE chart kind of evolved from there, kind of in a pragmatic way. And so the whole thing, and then there were some other tools that kind of grew out of that, and the whole thing ended up being about like having a training program that reacted to your training response, that we knew that each lifter responded a little bit differently, and we wanted a training approach that would react to that. So that's kind of the genesis of the name.
Yeah, and it's because I guess, do you think, is it maybe a false dichotomy to, or like a problem that does not exist, or like a problem that it's not, you don't have to pick between the two when we're talking about, I guess, reactive versus proactive? Do we have to pick between the two? Is it more in elements, or sort of elements of programming that we have to pick between reactive and proactive? Like, is there a hard line? Like, is there certain things that you will plan out proactively, I guess?
Yeah. Well, I mean, that kind of meshes up with the emerging strategy stuff that I've been talking about more recently, which is kind of the name we've given to the framework that we use for planning training. So anytime you sit down to plan training, there's this kind of set of rules that's operating either consciously or unconsciously in the background, that the set of norms that you follow, so you don't have to reinvent the wheel for every program that you write. We just have to give those set of norms, a particular set of norms, a name, emerging strategies. And it does prioritize, well, it's a bottom-up model, primarily a bottom-up model, but like you're alluding to, there's no such thing as like in reality, if you look at programs that are actually done by real people, there's nothing that's completely bottom up or completely top down. It's always somewhere in the middle. Now, emerging strategies does draw the line more on the bottom up side, I would say, versus traditional planning approaches, which are a little bit more regimented, a little bit more top down. I mean, I think you can get to something that's planned out in advance a little bit more if you've got enough athlete data and the athlete is kind of living this consistent athlete lifestyle. but we need to be cautious about that, and I don't know, almost like looking at it like a gift, like,
Yeah.
well, it's good that we have this and we can plan, for this particular time period of a little bit further out into the future, but it's not going to be that way forever,
Yeah. Like, for instance, one of the things that really sort of hit me is like, okay, if we're actually going to use auto regulation, I guess, or use like if we're going to plan programming, right? It's like one of my friends, Colby, I don't know if you're familiar with him. He's one of Eric's students, very, very smart PhD student at AUT. He was talking to me about how, like, what is, for instance, what is the problem with just not changing anything from week to week? And it's like,
Yeah.
okay, not that much really. And it's like, how much are you going to adapt? Realistically, not that much. And like, as you were saying with the athlete who, I guess, there's a word that my friends have been saying, or some people from JPS have sort of talked to me recently, on neurobiological backdrop, which effectively, to my understanding, means sort of the how much your stress levels are sort of undulating or changing. And it's like, it is just quite uncommon where someone's year round in a perfect sort of environment and everything is just spot on, and that it's like that you're going to know, like, for instance, one of my assignments, I got given it today at university. It's like planning. They were like, okay, can you make a whole year plan for this athlete? And I'm like, I was thinking in my head, I'm sitting in the class, like I'm talking to Mike T in like 4 hours. And I'm like, I'm just thinking about that, like that you've got that week, that sort of one microcycle and then change it approach.
Yeah.
And it's like,
yeah. Well, it's funny, right? Like I've talked to, like where I learned a lot of this stuff, the kind of the basic framework of it, and it comes from Dr. Bondarchuk, and his system for coaching throwers, hammer throw primarily, but also shot put and others. But the person who I would say really made this accessible was Derek Evely. And he's a Canadian track and field coach, and he was telling me that they had a similar sort of thing, but for them it was like for the I don't know what the official name for it in Canada, but it's something like the Ministry of Sport or something like that. Like you have to present your annual plan to the officials who like bless it or something, and
what, like the annual training plan?
Yeah. So
Really?
you have to present it to them, and they, like, oh yes, we see the basic structure is intact, and like, and in the meantime, like you've got these guys who are like, I guess I have to do this in order to be able to coach, but this is antithetical to everything I believe about training.
I feel like I don't want to leave people who are listening to this behind. Like, would you agree that sort of the, like, because to me it seems more, even like at the first when I first encountered this, I was like, oh, this seems obvious for powerlifting, but it's like even more for hypertrophy. It doesn't seem that different. And I mean the line between the two is not that it's not as great as we often perceive it to be.
I agree.
But it seems like this sort of reactive approach seems to be it's just, it doesn't seem as though you can sell it as much, and I think that's why it's not like the dominant thing that comes to people first, because it's not, I think, as sexy to be like, oh, I'm not changing variables really quickly. Well, I don't have a like, if you sell it, if you get a client and you send them a spreadsheet and it looks pretty much the same for the next whatever how many weeks, they're going to be like, what? In some ways, I think.
Yeah, no, I think it could be that way. I think you do have to show some care in how you communicate it. That I hadn't really had much trouble with that with most of my lifters, because my framing of it is, like, yes, we're going to reduce the variability, but it's going to be good for your performance, and it's going to show me things as a coach that I need to know to make things even better going forward, you know?
Right.
And, you know, so I wrote an article recently, and I tend to do a lot of thinking through writing. And something that occurred to me is, like, I used to write training that was different every week, and we would make modifications on the fly all the time. And it's not like an overt belief. It's not it's not a belief that, like, you select, but looking back on it, there is some belief in there that, you know, I'm a coach and I need to demonstrate my worth. You know, I need to demonstrate my value, and I'm going to do that by making some change, or like, but that's, making the change is not the value that a coach brings. You know, it's planning a great development cycle, or just noticing some pattern that otherwise would go unnoticed, or from a simply programming standpoint, like coaching, like big picture coaching is a really broad thing. Like, even like your value as a, yeah. But even like your value from a programming standpoint is more than just changing things. You know, like, it's got to be changing the right things, and then not changing things sometimes too. You know,
because it's like that almost is the right. It's like, if it's the right decision to make, it doesn't. Yeah, like, I guess maybe that feeling comes from, like, I guess as you said, like, sort of trying to prove your worth, trying to be like, hey, look, I'm a good coach.
Yeah, I'm doing things.
Yeah,
right?
like,
yeah.
Because I guess,
but that's it. So we go deep right away, right? Because this is like a bigger, much more insidious problem, is that it's really easy to discount things that are invisible. Like, it's hard to value illnesses prevented. It's hard to value accidents prevented, and injuries prevented, to bring it a little closer to home, you know, things like that.
How, like, for instance, how do you go about, like, there's a few things that I have noted down that I guess we could bring up and I'd put here, because I think they, like, what would you say guides the changes in programming for you? Like, is there, like, across the board with all athletes, general things that will guide programming decisions, and then is there more individual sort of things? Like, for instance, one of my clients gets allergies a few times a week, and we just note that down, and I'm trying to see if there's a pattern there. I can't see much yet, but it's like, we're trying to collect data on that and train around that. And it's like, I guess there's individual things like that, but is there, like, what sort of things, I guess, guide it for you?
The individualization process,
like, like, even just on a I guess on a broad level, like, what sort of metrics are you looking at? Like, obviously RPE is likely one, and we can go deeper into RPE as well, but I guess we'll leave that for now. But like, what sort of metrics would you be looking at? Like, for instance, I was speaking to my friends from Data Driven Strength the other day, and we were sort of discussing different metrics that they measure. Like, is it usually a quantitative thing that you've taken for instance, some subjective measure and you've turned it sort of quantitative, like RPE, or what sort of things, like, guide programming decisions?
So we'll start with the practical before I launch off into more abstraction. The main thing that we're looking at is estimated 1RM.
Okay.
So if you're looking at a powerlifters training program, then estimated 1RM seems to be, well, I mean, that's the closest benchmark to the thing that you care about the most, right? So lately, it's kind of in vogue in powerlifting training to, you know, take a weekly moderate single or something like that, which is really useful for this type of benchmarking, but it absolutely doesn't have to be that. You know, it could be anything, but you just need something that is a fairly reliable indicator of, you know, is your strength improving or not? And that starts to paint a picture, which I mean, to bring it back to you and like your work in hypertrophy, that's kind of the main hurdle that I see as far as bringing anything emerging strategy style to hypertrophy,
Yeah.
is how do you get that consistent progress measure,
Yeah.
right? Because you need to be able to measure it with enough granularity to see the differences, you know. And it needs to be something that you can measure fairly frequently. So I mean,
Yeah, I have definitely struggled with that. For instance, like I've thought about, okay, what about like sets of 8? Or like
sure.
and even that, it's like performance can undulate on that so much, and it's just like I don't know if performance is a perfect indicator of hypertrophy. Like a lot of Brian Miner's work has sort of opened me up to that. It's like we need a stimulus. We do not necessarily need a performance outcome. We do not need to, like I put it in a quote the other day on my Instagram. It was like, we don't really care about progression as long as we're getting a stimulus. Although there's no, like, we don't know when we're getting either of those. We know when we're getting progression, but we don't know when we're getting a stimulus. It's not like we're going to go and measure mTOR. It's like
right. Well, an idea. I'll just float this here, I guess. I pitched it to Greg Nichols because I wanted to know if he would tell me that I was, really, chasing windmills or something. But since I was doing all this isometric stuff in the time while I was moving, I started, of course, I'm thinking about isometrics a lot more, and it occurred to me that like this is something that's fairly low skill, and I mean, you would probably know better than I would. I want to say that I read somebody's commentary about some research showing that like performance on an isometric test was, it basically scaled to cross-sectional area, something along those lines. I mean,
I'm not sure. I haven't seen that in particular, but I have heard many conversations about that. I don't know, because it's just like it would be so muscle group dependent. It's like, what are you going to do? A pec fly? Like, like
yeah.
I mean, I guess you could, but
how would you operationalize it? Yeah, I mean,
like, what are you going to standardize how flexed your elbows are? Like,
are
you going to standardize the pec fly you're using? I would hope so. And it's like, are you going to do an AMRAP? Like, I don't know. Like, I guess you could estimate, like, estimated 10 RM or something, or like, what RPE are you doing? What weight in RPE? What's like, you could even track volume load on an isolation over time at a given RPE. Like, you'd even track an 8 RPE on an isolation in the muscle group you care about, maybe in like a specialization phase. But it's like, it's just so like many levels removed from actual hypertrophy. But I don't know if that even matters, because it's like, as long as you're ticking, because we know how to get hypertrophy. Like, it's not rocket science. Like, we know the lifestyle factors. We know the programming things that are generally like a good range. You can generally tell if you're doing a little too much, kind of. But it's like,
well, it seems to me that if you're it goes back to what you're saying, I think, on like stimulus and response. So if you're stimulating the muscle, you pretty much know that through the movement selection and whatnot.
yeah.
And if you're monitoring your, we'll just say, loading parameters and your recovery, then you're kind of doing all that you can. And you could also, like, I don't know, with powerlifting, we individualize lots of different things like exercises. I can individualize exercises, figure out if you respond best to pin squats or pause squats, because we're developing a skill. And even though the powerlifts are simple, there are like component skills within those movements.
Right.
So there's a little bit more to it. But really, like, I wonder if kind of this notion of stimulus to fatigue ratio or something like that is just,
I
if that's kind of where it goes, you know?
Yeah, I really like Mike Israel recently mentioned how like a sense this is kind of quite acute. Like for instance, how good was your workout? How stimulative was it? Was it at least it passed the threshold of like, okay, like for instance, he was using a sort of a gauge of talking about one, soreness isn't okay, not really like that soreness kind of can't, I don't think can be used as that good of a gauge. But maybe like acute sort of feelings of disruption could be like shakiness or sort of pump as well. Like one time I heard Mike talking about how sort of like if you're getting a really good pump, you're likely growing. I don't know if that tracks to be true 100% of the time, but I think it likely tracks to be true a lot of the time. I think.
Let's see, I guess I don't remember dates anymore and they're not really important, but there was like an 18-month or 2-year period where I was kind of losing my mind over fatigue. Like felt like I was gradually going crazier and crazier. Because there was this, like, I felt like something in our narrative around fatigue just wasn't quite right. And I don't really know where I sit with all of that now, but throughout the course of this, one thing that kept coming up is, I would say, the dominant narrative around fatigue now is it's this kind of unwanted byproduct.
Right.
And that if you can get stimulus without fatigue, then you can get more stimulus. And, you know, that's the ideal way to go, right? That it seems like stimulus, you know, your loading parameters, that's the gas, and fatigue is the brake. And
Right.
you know, you push as hard as you can until you run into this fatigue issue, and then you throttle back. Now it's interesting. I haven't coached any bodybuilders like through contest prep or anything, but just through like observing and talking to people who've kind of been through that process. They talk about, like, as the diet gets really hard, you have to make changes to the programming. You can't do as much stuff like squats and lunges and like the really difficult movements. And you find yourself looking, how do I get the stimulus to the muscle in the easiest way possible? And I mean, speaking about it from my position is at least once removed, right? I don't know why. Do you know why you would ever get away from that? Like,
well,
if you can get a stimulus to the muscle for less recovery costs,
I don't see where the downside is.
That?
Well, for instance, I don't know if you're aware too much of my background, but the reason I'm doing a bench press only powerlifting comp is because I have a metal spine. So I had scoliosis, so like it's all fused, and like it just can't. I can barely handle any squatting or deadlifting volume, even at really low weights. Like we're talking 100 kilo deadlifts, like really light. And I think it does come down to that. It does come down to the point. Well, I mean, it's a very specific issue in my case because it's like there's certain areas that just become issues like that if I do certain movements. And especially when it comes to hypertrophy, it's like I don't see why we don't just need that stimulus without the fatigue. However, I do think commonly it's like the fatigue has to come with the stimulus because the stimulus is often high mechanical loading.
Sure.
And there's ways I think we can get around it. Like for instance, we compare a barbell back squat if the goal is hypertrophy to a hack squat or like a leg press. But then it's like there might be even downsides to that potentially that we can't see.
Yeah, and maybe that's it, right? Like I do tend to think that there is some sort of like collective wisdom that gets enshrouded in like the way things, like the way we do things culturally, you know. It's not anything close to foolproof, but it's at least worthy of consideration, right?
Yeah.
So that's the thing that gives me pause, right? So again, using my own experience as this litmus test, I'm tracking I'm doing all this training, focusing on front squats and trying to get my front squat max up, and doing all that. Then when it's time to move, we pack up the gym and it gets shipped. So now there's like this 3-month period, close to 3-month period, where I'm basically just doing living room workouts with whatever I can fit in my suitcase, right? Which ends up being isometrics and bands and BFR, and I get pretty damn inventive with like how to do a good job with like band lunges and band split squats and stuff like that, and like actually make it challenging.
Yeah.
It's easy for it to just not be that great, but with enough effort, it can work. What I noticed is that I was able to tolerate more loading with that movement. My joints didn't hurt.
You mean
my joints have never been like terrible anyway.
Afterwards, after the 3 months.
Well, so then I come back to barbell training afterwards, and at first I feel great. Like it's like, oh, I didn't understand like how much like just like this basic level of discomfort, had just become normal, right? Yeah. Which that's probably a problem.
I wonder how much though. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a problem for future Mike to solve. But I've noticed too that all of my like soreness markers and like stiffness markers and stuff like that have been elevated, and just kind of the way I'm managing my volume now, it's driving this reduction in loading compared to what I was doing when it was like just split squats with bands and stuff like that, and isometrics. It seems like the split squats and isometrics were easier to tolerate,
right? So you think you could do more total volume, either way you measure it? Well, I guess
I think so. I mean, isometrics are weird because how do you measure?
How you measure those,
man? So we were talking about Eric earlier. Pretty early on, I'm looking at it and going like, this doesn't make any sense. So I got on the phone with Eric at least once, I think maybe a couple times, and was just like losing my mind over this. Like we got to figure this out, right? And I mean, it comes back to like, well, there's just not a lot of parity, so maybe just session RPE, just eyeball it.
Yeah, because I mean, at the end of the day, for instance, right, like when you're programming for yourself, you get all your biofeedback, you get everything, you get all your internal everything. It's like, but then it's like applying that to an athlete is different, because it's like, how do you prescribe?
Well, it's been the thing for me over the years too, is like, I love thinking about this stuff, but I also like to operationalize it and systematize it.
Yeah.
And my thought is that if it's a system that I'm going to drop any of my athletes into, it ought to be a system that I'm willing to drop my own training into. Like I know how important this is to me. So if I'm not willing to trust it with my training, then why should I trust it with my athletes' training, kind of thing?
Yeah. Do you for instance, when you first sort of started using RPE, how did you begin to implement that? Like, did you find, because it's like people will say things about RPE, like when I explain RPE to people who've never heard of it before, it's like, there's always those sort of, there's like the familiarization, like actually making sure they understand what it actually means, like the RIR system, like what is this, et cetera, and like what actually is one RIR, blah, blah, blah. And then there's also like the issue, like for instance, recently I've been thinking, I don't know if it's necessarily a good idea to prescribe relatively high RPEs at really high rep ranges for isometric exercises in particular. If the goal is hypertrophy, because it seems as though potentially it might be just too hard to gauge. But I'm talking like instead of a 4 RPE, maybe a 2 on like isometrics, random numbers. But it's Yeah, like how do you go about sort of like actually implementing something like RPE with athletes? And I guess it's you've coached like I'm assuming you've coached people that are sort of relatively beginner or like not super, super advanced, but I know you've coached very, very advanced people. So like, do you find there's a massive difference between those two sort of populations? Like just, I guess, years lifting, like, is that a really good predictor of how well they can use RPE?
Yeah. Yeah. So the basis of your judgment is kind of what you've done so far, you know? So I find that people who don't have a big background in like training close to failure uh, are not that skilled with high RPE numbers. You know, it comes on relatively quickly, you know. So yeah, I mean, there's a learning curve to it. I don't think it's that critical to be ultra precise with it. I
Right.
think the more precise you can be, the better, of course. But if you're getting in the ballpark, then you're probably getting, it's probably good from the 80-20 rule. You
Yeah.
know, you're
Yeah.
probably getting most of the benefit from it. And then like each additional increment of accuracy gets you a smaller and smaller return, you know.
Yeah.
That's my sense of it anyway.
Yeah. Do you like, for instance, here's one thing that I don't think I yet completely understand that I don't know. How does like prescribed RPE change for you, or I guess for you, and how you change it for athletes, like over the mesocycle or over, I guess, because I know you have the sort of rolling microcycle, and then you
Mm.
have sort of the different types of sort of responders, and then you probably know of individual athletes and stuff. But like, yeah, how do you like? When do you find you change the prescribed RPE? Like, is it exercise dependent or is it competition dependent?
A little bit, a little bit. Well, it's kind of the intention, you know, behind the exercise. That so kind of to describe that, let's talk about another concept that I really ought to write about. Call it stress index. But we know that volume, like volume in terms of tonnage, is not really a great way of measuring like the cost of exercise, you know, like the recovery demand, because you could do a very high volume session or a very low volume session and it doesn't really tell you anything about how difficult the session was or how long it's going to take you to recover from it.
Mm.
What does tell you about that is um, another article that appeared on Greg Knuckles' site a while back was talking about number of hard sets, and that struck me as like a good conceptual place to begin. Um, the only thing is like what counts as a hard set, and is it a binary? Well, no, obviously not. So like there ends up being this gradient, and long story short, the way I see it now is that the higher the RPE of the set, the greater the stress of that set, you know. And I mean, that's not a landmark concept by itself, but once you do put real numbers on it, then you can start to um, find this balance point between, you know, like for example, if you're going to do triples at 9 RPE in this block, how many triples should you do? Versus in the next block, you plan to do triples at 6 RPE. How many triples do you do then? Obviously, you'll do more sets if the RPE is lower, but how many more sets? You know, like if we can be specific, then we can be prescriptive, you know? So like, I think the concept is very familiar to people,
Yeah.
but it's just being specific enough to make it like, to be able to make actionable decisions using that information. Anyway, that kind of got us off track a little bit. So when I'm planning training, it's a little bit like, what are we trying to accomplish with this? Do I want them to strain under the load? Is there something that I'm trying to teach them that where that's going to be valuable? You
Right.
know, there's a lot of things that are happening in a powerlifting context. Like, let's take the bench press, for example. The bar path that you need to use can be a little counterintuitive. You've got to
Right.
practice it. And it's hard to practice it with light weights, low RPEs, easy sets, right?
Yeah.
So, utilizing some higher RPE work is useful in that sense. And it also helps with like composure under a heavy load. So like with a squat, for example, lots of people experience just straight up fear or anxiety when they walk out something and it feels really heavy, or they know that this set's going to be hard, So it's a little bit like you can expose an athlete to that and they'll be more composed. They'll be better able to maintain technique in a slower lift and things like that.
Yeah.
Or maybe you're, like the data-driven strength guys have been talking about a lot lately with the high force output, low intraset fatigue sets. Basically, like low RPE sets allow you to practice producing higher levels of force. So like in the old days, they would say you get more first reps, which the first rep is most
Right.
specific
Okay.
for a powerlifter, right?
Yeah.
So there's that aspect of it as well. You're doing lower rep sets with, a given intensity, given bar weight. So, you get more sets, you get more practice on, I would say, basic technique stuff, but also just more practice producing high force output.
Yeah. And I guess that is one of the things that differentiates powerlifting quite a lot. I'm very envious of powerlifting programming because it's so complex. What seems at least complex on the outside, and it seems infinitely like hypertrophy is kind of solved. Mechanical tension, boom, we got it. Like the end. Like not really, but it's I don't know how much better we can get at programming for hypertrophy, which is unfortunate. Do you like?
I just want to say, like, I feel your pain on that. That there's something like you simultaneously want to figure out the puzzle, but it's a little bit sad if the mystery's gone.
Yeah, like
I feel you there.
yeah, I like, for instance, I love sports science and I love the ideas of that and just the idea of optimization. But it's like for hypertrophy, we kind of actively can't chase optimization because there's no acute measure of progress. Like there's nothing good. Like I wish we had even if we had like a blood glucose level easy sort of measure of muscle protein synthesis, even that wouldn't be that good because then we're relying on MPS. It's like, it's just we've got nothing. Like I don't know.
Pretty far away from it technologically, it seems like.
Yeah.
Like you would be as well if you didn't have, if you're trying to implement this with hammer throw, but you didn't have a tape measure.
Yeah. Yeah. It's like, so can I ask, when you first sort of started using RPE, were you skeptical of it or was it obvious? Like, was it like, oh, this is really going to be useful? Like, or is it kind of something that naturally fell into place?
Good question. I think this has been 15 years ago now, so
Wow.
I don't think I was that skeptical of it, and I think part of that was hubris. Part of that was just coming from where the powerlifting world was at that time, or at least my little corner of it. Again, with people talking about hey, you really ought to leave a rep in the tank so that you have a little bit more recovery ability. And then I was looking at these weird Shako programs that all had strange numbers attached to them, and you're doing 80% triples and 85% doubles. What's that about? And then there's speed work, like West Side style speed work. And like, how does all this stuff fit into this paradigm, of like, because once you realize that, whether you're tracking RPE or not, that a set does have a difficulty level, and that difficulty level is probably relevant to something that you care about, then it's hard to look away from it,
Right.
It becomes, then it's a matter of like, okay, well, what's the right number then? 10 RPE or 5 RPE or somewhere in the middle, mix it up or not.
Do you think we can actually, like, for instance, people will give numbers of like, okay, 3 to 4 reps, at least 3 to 4 reps in reserve, and boom, hypertrophy will occur. Things like that. Like, do you think that is, do we need to be skeptical of that, or like individualize that? Like for instance, for me, I definitely I spend a lot of time at 3 reps in reserve, a lot of time there. I don't spend that much time at 4, but I sometimes you can't tell the difference. But it's like, I feel like for me personally, that's the best place for me to stay. But then I feel like for a lot of my athletes, they can just handle a lot more volume. Well, they not volume, but well, I can't remember what the word you used was. What was the way you measured sort
like
of interest?
The stress.
Yeah,
like the training stress.
Yeah, per set. Yeah, like because it's more than just number of hard sets, because it's like it's like that. It feels as though many of my athletes can handle. I have to sort of let my own training response go to the side a little bit, because it's a little stunted. I feel as though.
Well, it's not to derail us from this, but I think that's important to do as a coach. And I think that's like, it's simultaneously really important and also really easy to do. That, I mean, I still notice it, that go back a couple of years, and I'm obviously a programming nerd, but I just like rediscovered Cal Dietz's stuff on triphasic training, which, regardless of what you think of it, I looked at it and I thought, that's a neat idea, and I haven't done anything in that space for a while. Let's run a block of it and see how it goes. And that went well for I can't remember who I tried it with, but it went well enough. And I thought, I had a bunch of athletes who were kind of in a space where they could try some stuff. So it became this thing where like all my athletes all at once are doing like 6-second eccentrics and things like that, right? And some it really worked well for, some not so much, but there's trends like that pop up in programming. There's biases where if I feel like doing a high volume block, that's a really salient feeling for me. My bias, like I notice, I tend to write more volume into the blocks that I'm writing. And I thought, that's not right. That's not how this is supposed to go, right?
It's hard to. How do you get rid of that though? It's very hard, very, very hard.
Well, I don't think you can get rid of it entirely. There are some biases that you're just going to bring to the table as a coach, but that's kind of where a lot of the block review process and just the structure around emerging strategies, like the intention for me was to get away from a lot of those biases. Like, show me what the athlete response is,
Right. Yeah.
Now, like the eccentrics thing, that's a little bit different because we did happen to be in this space where we can do experimentation. And if you're doing an experimental block, it doesn't really matter. Like, yeah, there's somewhat of a data-driven component to it, but there's also a random creative element to it as well. But when you get to these, lately we've been calling them exploit development cycles, where you're trying to exploit the information that you've gathered through all these other development cycles.
Right.
when you get there, then there shouldn't be any of that. There shouldn't
Right.
be any of this like, oh, well, I feel like doing intensity. So all my athletes are doing intensity, right? And I'm not saying anybody's doing that consciously, but it's the subconscious trends to be on the lookout for.
Yeah.
And like the thought experiment that came up for me is like, is there like some way of training for powerlifting that I just don't think would work? You know, if I had an athlete where like that's actually what they respond best to, can I still arrive at that conclusion?
Right.
You know?
Yeah. Do you feel as though and I guess to arrive at the conclusion, there needs to be something pointing to indicate that it is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I mean, I don't know if I'm all the way there. I think there's lots of things that we can always continue to improve on, but I have discovered things that are pretty counterintuitive from looking at those types of responses. You know, like powerlifters that just aren't getting anything out of high intensity stuff. Like if we go past like low 80% range, then they're just getting beat up from it. Like it's not really doing much for them.
Yeah.
And
that's how I feel like
counterintuitive, you know?
Right.
Like, to me, it's like, well, I mean, once you look at it and you see that pattern in the data, you can't unsee it. And you go, like, what should you do with this? Well, that's obvious once you see it, but having a system in place that allows you to see it is the trick.
Yeah.
I think.
So would you say you could even make a broad generalization in some way to say, like across the board, hitting super high RPEs all the time for most people likely isn't optimal? Like, when would you, there's two different ways I want to go. I want to go with this other thing because I think this question won't make sense if I try and articulate this. But so going back to sort of the trying to find, I'm not even going to try and do that. I mean, so basically with the rolling microcycles, you have sort of the rolling microcycle or like the emerging strategies style sort of microcycle. Is the goal, like what with that, I guess, I think it was in your conversation with Bryce where you might have talked about this a little bit, but it's sort of, is there like, with that, is the goal to reach a point where eventually, not that you will always default to this, but like it's a safe, could you get to a point where you're trying to use data basically to find, or like response to find, oh, we know this setup works really well for this athlete, so it's a safe thing to go back to, because I guess you've got that time to peak and all that. And
yeah, to me it's an epistemic solution, right? That
what do you mean by that?
Well, the question is like, what's the best training for this athlete? Like what's the thing that we can do training wise that's the best choice for them? You know, the most important time is pre-competition. That's really when that question is imperative, right? So how do we answer that in a reliable way that doesn't, the ways that I was answering it before just didn't feel robust enough, I guess.
Right. Yeah. And then one other thing that sort of I was thinking about a lot when I sort of first saw that general structure. Would you, so in terms of periodization, like would you still go through and like, how often would you be planning out like, oh, we're going to have a block where here, or like a series of blocks or whatever, where the goal is hypertrophy, or even if it's just one block, whatever, you know, like the goal is hypertrophy, or the goal is high volume block. And do you see those two things as similar, or like, would you spend, would your hypertrophy blocks or your blocks where you're aiming for a specific adaptation, or in general, emphasizing a specific adaptation more, would that generally correlate? So I guess there's two questions here. But it's like, yeah, so one, would the hypertrophy block generally be looking at sort of lower RPEs with higher volumes in general? And then also, how So we'll go over that first, and then I'll write down the other things so I don't forget it. But it's like the
Well,
like how much proactive long-term periodization is there, I guess, if that's the right phrase.
very little.
How little?
If I've got an athlete that I know fairly well, I mean, it's not like crazy, but say we've been working together for a year. It's been a good year. I might be able to plan 2 blocks into the future,
Okay.
maybe 3.
Right.
I usually don't put any structure on it, like hypertrophy block or
Right.
well, I shouldn't say that. That comes down the road. So let me give you 2. You have lots of questions and I have lots of answers to every one of them apparently. So I'm going to give you 2 answers to this. The first is like the emerging strategies doctrine answer. And that's important because I think, like you mentioned, the conversation I had with Bryce, I think one of the things that I was trying to get across there is that there may be a lot of ways to arrive at this conclusion, but can you systematize it? Can you teach this to someone who doesn't already know how to figure out the problem, right? And emerging strategies tries to do that, and it does that through this imposition of like this bottom-up planning structure. And if you plan according to the structure, then you get a reliable, good result from it. And then once you understand the structure, then you can decide, this piece can be modified. This piece I don't need right now. So it's kind of once you know the rules, then you can pick and choose when to break them and that kind of thing. Right. So let's start with what the rules are and just kind of the basic framework for understanding how that goes. You would not plan that very far into the future. The only time that you really plan into the future, like multiple blocks, would be if you're getting ready to peak for a competition and you need to make sure that your timing is correct and that you're applying the most effective exercises and protocols in the block immediately before competing, so that you're not using up those means and methods in the block immediately preceding that and things like that. So you do a little bit of planning in that sense, but it's not like I need a hypertrophy block and that needs to be followed by this. Like it's not like a intensity progression,
right? Yeah.
It's a effectiveness progression. We know the last block needs to be the most effective. The block before that, if we know enough about the athlete, can be the second most effective. And then you probably aren't planning any further out than that because something's going to come up, like nobody goes like 4 months, and doesn't have something happen that is at least a little disruptive, right?
In this case, when talking effective, do you mean sort of like, I guess, competition day peaking? Like, the goal is to get strength on that day.
Effective in terms of producing a reliable high result in the
right.
In this case, it's estimated 1RM, but assuming that there's a pretty strong correlation between the estimated and actual, right?
Yeah.
But so where you can go from there, I kind of describe these as levels. So when you first start emerging strategies, the first level of knowledge that you're trying to get is like direct cause and effect knowledge, right? So things like time to peak, things like exercises, protocols, intensities, RPEs, stuff like that. Like when I do pin squats, my squat goes up. When I do front squats, my deadlift goes up. Like that type of very direct interaction, right? But then once you have that fairly well sorted, then you can start to focus on level 2, which would be what can I do in the pivot block, the space between development blocks, to better maintain my strength, but also still recover. What can I do to improve my durability and whatnot? Once you have that, fairly well sorted, you can go beyond that and say, is there something that I can do in the preceding development block that will enhance the result of my next development block?
Right.
And that
Okay.
can start to look like hypertrophy block followed by strength block. But, oh, by the way, as you start ascending these levels, the foundational levels are changing because your body's this adaptive organism that is always like responding and changing.
And
so, I mean, it's not like crazy. Like you wouldn't expect to go from responding really well to, to high volume to, completely the opposite, but it's going to shift and move around a bit.
What sort of foundational, I don't know if you finished there.
No.
Like what sort of things?
There's like the second branch to this, but let's pause there for a
So
second.
when you talk about sort of the foundational things that you will note to change, is there like things you've noted that over time in general, as an athlete gets more advanced, like what kind of things do you find change?
I don't know that there's like a progression to it. Like
for instance, maybe tolerance to number of hard sets. Do you find that changes? Not much,
to be honest. That it can shift a little bit, but it's a little bit different too, because most people that I'm working with have been doing this for several years, and I think most of their work capacity has been developed at that point.
Yeah.
Unless we're gonna like do something intentional about developing it further.
Right.
Yeah.
And then what?
I was gonna say like so that's kind of the doctrinal answer, but I was talking to one of my athletes about this who is coming, his name's Mehar, and he's coming from more of a higher volume background, something looks more like Shaco style training and things like that. And my training style is quite a bit different. Like this is very high intensity and lots of heavy weights. And, so far it's been going really well, and he was asking me a very similar question, like, hey, is there a volume block? Is this ever a thing? Like, and, I said, well, the way it's probably going to play out in reality is as long as we're doing this thing, this higher RPE, higher intensity thing, and that's working really great, we're just going to keep riding the wave.
Yeah.
And like things are going great. Let's keep doing that. And at some point it's going to stop working because everything stops working eventually. And so this will slow down and stop, and we'll try a block. We'll have some ideas. We'll try some different things. Maybe it'll work, maybe it won't. But at some point we're going to have this plateau that's going to happen, and you're going to say, I'm getting a little frustrated. Maybe we ought to just do a hypertrophy block or something like that. I'm just going to have a little fun with training for a block, and then we'll get back to it. So we'll write that up, and you're going to do it, and your strength's going to go crazy. And we'll go, oh, we just learned something new. Now, your response has shifted, So that's kind of the way that I've seen it play out in the past.
Right. Yeah. So
like this, the hypertrophy block, strength block ratio kind of becomes this emerging property of the framework itself.
Right. So for instance, this is a little bit derailing. However, I think it still adds maybe a level of understanding to this. In hypertrophy, I at least don't yet. I've talked to a few people about this, and I haven't yet found anything that's been conclusive on sort of a sensitization and then desensitization to hypertrophy. And that's just, I guess, hypertrophy specific. And I guess you're talking about like you'll try something and then it'll work and then it won't work. And then like, what do you think is the thing that makes the plateau happen? What is that? Do you think that's like a genuine downregulation of something, or like something's just not occurring, or like psychological, or multitude of reasons? But
yeah, I don't know. So I'll tell you kind of where my crazy thought process has been going. And if Eric does happen to listen to this, he'll roll his eyes at me again. Because let me explain my thought process, and I'll tell you why he's got a good point. So my thinking lately is that there's something important about an athlete's ability to pay attention and be engaged in the training process.
Right.
That I feel like when the athletes come in and they're kind of on autopilot, you know,
right. And
they're not
would
really
you say
thinking about
motivation tracks to that quite highly, would you say? Maybe not with everyone.
Motivation, I don't, because different people mean really different things when it comes to motivation. Enthusiasm
to train
tracks to that.
Right. Okay.
Like if you're going to the gym and excited, then for sure we're in a good spot. But even if you're not necessarily like excited, if you're at least paying attention, you know, like the example that I give sometimes is like if you come into the gym on Monday and you always squat on Monday, and it's Monday, so you always squat and you bring the same stuff and you go to the same rack and you face the same way, you use the same bar, and like it's the same, your warm-ups are the same. And yeah, okay, this week the top set's a triple instead of a set of 4, and like, okay, but you're still squatting on Monday and it's still like basically the same thing. And most of the time you're on autopilot and you're not really, you don't even have to think about it. You know, people will like, have you ever had someone who kind of did the wrong workout because they were on autopilot and they weren't really looking at the sheet?
I mean, mine's pretty flexible, like relative. I try to let my clients know that they can be quite flexible with volume. Like for instance, if they're doing a 4-day split, they can make it a 6-day split for 1 week, just because like I don't see the downside. Like for instance, they could take their upper volume from this session and move it, but I don't think so.
I've had that experience, which, you know, you would think that, you know, doing the same thing every week, you'd find your pattern, and, you know, at least you would be repetitive with the, you know, but occasionally, you know, you find somebody, they just kind of get in autopilot and they do the thing that autopilot led to, which happened to be the wrong workout, you know.
So they do like last week's workout, or
right, okay. Or, you know,
some other thing.
Oh, it's a new block. I forgot it was a new block. Or, you know, like, well, I think if you're on autopilot like that, like, you're probably not getting as much out of this as you could. And I don't, like, the reason I mentioned Eric's reaction to this argument is that he would point out that there's something physiological that's happening. You know, there's nothing magic about our attention, you know, and I have to agree, you know, in fact, you know, I have to agree, but I think that there are certain things that, you know, it's a useful narrative, I think, it's the way that it seems on a practical level.
Right.
And as long as we don't start convincing ourselves that that's the way it really is, then we can extract the utility from it, you know.
Okay.
Which I think we'd find some common ground on that. So
yeah. I don't know. I guess with hypertrophy, I'm a little more skeptical on the sensitization, desensitization thing, because for me at least, there would need to be some kind of, like, if we assume that we're correct about mechanical tension being the driver or whatever, or what stimulates mTOR, etc. It's like we would need to see some down regulation. And I was looking at some stuff that Eric sent me, and the only thing that I've seen is like with age down regulation, or not down regulation is probably the wrong word, but sort of like less of hypertrophy being less effective, the stimulus for hypertrophy being less effective. And it's like, doesn't seem like it's tied to training age. It doesn't seem as though there's actual chemical down regulation occurring. So it's like, to me, it seems as though the same mechanical tension should produce relatively the same outcome in general.
But can you get the same mechanical tension from a disengaged athlete?
That is true. That's why I think it needs to be like, that's where I guess the role of a low volume phase for hypertrophy, I think, has a role. I don't think it's necessarily a physiological thing. I think it's more likely like psychological recovery.
Yeah. And maybe that's the intersection between performance and hypertrophy training, right? That if you're like, imagine going for a training session where you're extremely distracted or bored or something like that, or tired. You just aren't able to generate the same stimulus as you would if you're focused and, you know, in some sort of at least neutral mind state, you know?
No, that definitely makes sense.
So I wonder if, you know, I think there may be even something to this from the standpoint of like exercises, because one strange byproduct of the time to peak concept is time to peak seems to be tied to your number of exposures to a given stimulus, not necessarily the time itself.
Right. Okay. Yeah.
So like as long as you're getting the correct amount of stress per unit of time, because if stress is, let's simplify it and say stress is related at least a lot to like physical damage, muscle damage, or something like that, you need time to recover from that. So as long as stress is controlled, we've noticed that athletes, if you're doing 2 microcycles in a week, that they peak roughly twice as fast.
Right.
If you're doing 1 microcycle a week, or you can spread it out even further. And the peak happens even later. Right. But it shouldn't be tied to just recovery, because again, we're controlling for stress. So what is that?
Do you feel as though like there's been or do you feel as though we don't yet completely understand the picture of like peaking of like in all sports maybe?
Yeah, I mean
getting a complete picture of anything's hard, but
well,
because it's like the way you talk about it, at least it seems as though like the traditional way of trying to peak an athlete, like this time to peak thing, and like all the, I guess, data you've probably collected mentally or whatever over the long period of time, seems pretty like it's not what people would be taught in a lecture, for instance, like, because I think it would be so hard to teach in some ways. Well, I mean, that's probably what you're doing with emerging strategies, I guess, is teaching it. I think it's teachable, but like I'm also teaching it from a pragmatic standpoint, you know, that like this time to peak thing, I don't know what the mechanism would be for it. Yeah.
I have this observation that I've made, and it seems to, like, my current, I guess, theory is that it might have something to do with that attentional quality. You know, that if you're the kind of person who gets bored with that type of same workout every week, then you'll get bored and then not extract the value from the session. Then, you know, your performance doesn't go up. So that looks like a peak, and we change the stimulus to something else, and you get the change that you need. You know, now, does it matter that is driven from a psychological standpoint? I mean, I suppose now is a good time to acknowledge that that's kind of that's another false narrative, that there's a difference between the psychological and the physiological, like, oh, well, that just is an occurrence in your brain. That doesn't count.
Well, it's like
Right?
at the end of the day, we can't draw a solid line between the two. It's because
Right.
like if they end up doing the same thing, it's like, okay, they end up
Yeah.
like decreasing your ability to perform or whatever. It's like, what is realistically the outcome, I guess, there?
Yeah. So I think the mechanisms and stuff are fascinating, but I also understand that that's not my not my strong suit compared to, guys who've gone to school and studied this stuff. Like I've studied some mechanisms casually, so I wouldn't put myself on the same level.
So just out of curiosity, maybe we should have done this at the start, but like, do you have formal education in exercise science?
No.
Like, so how it's just all from learning through doing, basically?
Well, learning through doing, and I mean, I read I read less now that I have too much stuff going on in my life, but when I have free time, I read about lifting weights.
Right.
and I'm not too picky about sources, but only because I don't think you have to be super picky about sources as long as you understand the sources that you're reading. Like
Right.
if you're going to T Nation and reading some articles there, that's fine as long as you understand, like, hey, this is creativity fuel. This might give me some ideas, but I need to not get married to any of these ideas. I need to understand, it might be a catalyst for looking into more reliable sources somewhere else.
Right. Yeah.
But, I mean, I'm not saying like pay no attention to the sources that you're consuming, just understand what it is that you're consuming, and I think there's lots of interesting ideas.
Yeah, that's the thing. It's like I get a lot of value out of listening to people that I don't see as inside the evidence-based bubble, because it's like, and I don't like that that's a thing, but it kind of is a thing. The whole evidence-based thing, like I don't know. It's like we can't really get away from it. Like it exists, is there, because people see evidence-based as safe and reputable and whatever.
Sure.
And if you're outside of that, then it's like, oh no. And that's a whole other thing. But
yeah, I mean, this goes in a totally different direction, and not that I'm super qualified to speak on creativity or anything, but I think it's a good idea to look outside of your little bubble, especially if you're interested at all in creative solutions, which I think a coach should be interested in creative solutions. That's a big part of the job.
Yeah. Because it's like, otherwise, I mean, I'm so new to coaching, but it's like, for me, when I'm doing my best job as a coach, I'm coming up with something that is a unique or creative solution to their problem. It's like, no matter what the problem is.
And it still fits within like what we know about human physiology or anything like that. Like it has to be a valid creative solution. Of course, obviously, but there are different ways to solve different problems, and you can derive inspiration for that from some pretty kind of far out there places sometimes.
So I think we've gone for a while, but here we have.
We didn't get to most of the questions that you wanted to ask.
I mean, there's a lot of stuff I want to talk about all the time, but this is always what it's like when I interview someone where I've listened to a lot of this stuff. It's like, oh man, I could talk forever with these people. It's just like, it is what it is. I mean, it's like, I'm the kid I studied podiatry for my undergrad. And that was interesting because I liked running at the start of it and I didn't like running at the end of it. I just couldn't be bothered, didn't like it, didn't enjoy it. And I was like, anytime anything came around lifting, I would put my hand up, ask a question. But it's like, these are the wrong people to ask. I was like craving exercise science knowledge, and I had to get it through the podcast. And now it's like, I still do that. But it's cool now. My class is kind of touching it, but they kind of exercise. Well, they are exercise science now, which is cool. But the
arc of things.
Yeah, I'm very, very grateful now to be actually learning exercise science. It's refreshing to not learn about feet. It's not the funnest thing. But we'll finish off there. So, Mike, where can people find you online? Do you like offer coaching very much, or is it like quite hard to get into? Or I know you have other coaches and reactive training system as well, and like where are the places you want people to go to find your stuff?
Okay. I suppose I should start by saying information about like most of these topics is, well, a lot of it can be on our YouTube channel, just Reactive Training Systems there, and Reactive Training Systems on Instagram. We're pretty active there. And I have a personal Instagram page as well. We have a website, reactivetrainingsystems.com. And the reason that might be interesting in the age of social media is that we have a training log that we've built that's on that website for free for anyone to use. And it's designed over the years to kind of move in this emerging strategies direction. So you log your training, you can run reports on that training, block reviews and meta block reviews, this same stuff that I talk about with emerging strategies. There's tools there available for you to kind of help extract the meaning from your training log information. So I suppose those are the main things as far as where I'm at and kind of what we're up to.
And you also have a very nice podcast, Reactive Training Systems Podcast. Is that what it's called?
I think so. Pretty much anywhere. If you look Reactive Training Systems, we might have something up there.
I'll link it all in there, but I'll leave it at your last word there.